people that are visiting us tonight, and of course to our speaker as well, who Ken will be introducing. This topic, a lot of people, of course, are aware of the Trumpeter Swan program, but it's always good to know more about it and to know where it's at this point. Just a quick story that I had experienced the other day. I've seen a lot of Trumpeter Swans at the Y Marsh and in the area, but I happened to be out at Tiny Marsh on Sunday, walking along through the woods there, and didn't expect to see any swans because I think the marsh itself was probably frozen at that point. But there's a little creek or stream that runs along the trail, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with who have been there. And I looked down the hill, there was a single swan just gliding along this jet black stream on a sunny day with the snow, and oh my God, it was just such a beautiful sight. So even after all this time, just, to see a single swan like that, just so magical. So they really are an amazing bird. Just one more thing before we switch over to our speaker. Memberships for the club we're due at the beginning of January. So if anybody would still like to get a membership, they're certainly available, and we would encourage you to send that in to us. Ken, I don't know if you want me to get into any details about how to pay it or whether they can find that on the website.
Online.
Yeah, I think you can find out. Go to mpfn.xyz. It'll give you all the instructions.
Great. Okay, so thank you to everybody who has renewed, and if anybody would still like to, then we would gladly accept your money. Helps keep the club going. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Ken now, and Ken will introduce our speaker for tonight.
Welcome everybody, and give a big welcome to our speaker, Liz Benneian. And just say a little bit about her. Liz is a former journalist and newspaper editor. She's been leading environmental advocacy and educational organizations since 2004. She's the executive director and manager of environmental education for Ontario Green Conservation Association. And that group provides environmental education in classrooms and communities. For the past 8 years, she's also been the spokesperson for the Trumpeter Swan Coalition. This group is dedicated to protecting the overwintering habitat of 1/5 of Ontario's Trumpeter Swan population that gathers every winter at LaSalle Park in Burlington. In recognition of her dedication to preserving and enhancing the environment, she has received local, provincial, and national awards. So welcome, Liz, to the Midland-Penetanguishene Field Naturalists. And if you unmute yourself, you can share your screen and start the talk.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me tonight. So I'm just going to share my screen.
Uh-oh, what happened there?
We got your first slide up, Liz.
It should be filling the screen right now.
Yeah, it's on full screen now.
Okay. So tonight we're going to be talking about Trumpeter Swans, and as I understood from listening to the folks there, a lot of you already know the background story of the Trumpeter Swans, but there may be a few details in here that you haven't heard before. And for people who are just being introduced to the story tonight, I think you'll find it really, really interesting. So the thing that I love about the Trumpeter Swan story is it's really an amazing conservation comeback story. And we have so much bad environmental news that we have to deal with. This is one of the really good stories. So Trumpeter swans are native only to North America. They're the world's largest swan, and they have a wingspan of up to 2.4 meters.
Yep.
And they're distinguished from other swans by their all black legs, feet, and beaks. As youngsters, trumpeter swans are more gray than white with pink and black beaks. And sometimes the adults look like they're partly brown, especially down their necks and their chests, but that's just staining from the minerals in the water. So as they're pulling up the aquatic vegetation that they feed on, they get some brown staining down their chests. So you can tell the difference between trumpeter swans and some other swans in a few different ways. So you'll notice the trumpeter swan at the top has a red border on its lower mandible. It also doesn't have the yellow lore that the tundra swan has, that you can see near its eye there, although it's, you know, impossible to tell that when they're in the sky. The mute swans that we often see have orange bills, and they also have that kind of knob at the top of their bill. And then the snow goose is much smaller, and it has a very different bill shape. Trumpeter swans also have a very distinct V shape between their eyes, which also is different from the tundra swans. And of course, trumpeter swans are larger than tundra swans, and again, a little difficult to tell that when they're up in the air. So the history of trumpeter swans is that they were hunted. They were hunted for their meat. They were hunted for their feathers. I hear they were even hunted for the leather on their feet, which was made into little change purses. And as you can see in this picture, this Victorian woman has a beautiful swan feather boa. Trumpeters were hunted out of existence in Ontario, and the last one was shot by a hunter at Long Point in 1886. So flocks all across North America were decimated. And by the 1930s, they actually thought there were only 69 individual trumpeters left in the Western US. But then there was a small flock discovered in Alaska, and that prompted the American government to try and protect them. So they banned hunting, they started protecting habitat, and slowly but surely the population in the Western US built up. But nothing happened here until the 1980s. So conservation efforts in Ontario were led by Harry Lumsden, who was a retired Ministry of Natural Resources biologist. He managed to get some eggs from the Alaskan trumpeters, and he recruited some landowners in Northern Ontario in areas where trumpeters would traditionally have nested to start raising the birds. And so they had them in captivity for a few years, and then as the population started to build, they started to release them. Harry has been named an Order of Canada, and in 2012, he received the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario's Heritage Award for Lifetime Achievement for his efforts in restoring the trumpeter swans to Ontario. So today, thanks to 40 years of all volunteer conservation efforts, there's now about 2,000 trumpeter swans in Ontario. There's actually about 3,000, but 1,000 of those come up here to nest. They're really resident to the Midwestern US. And so at the beginning of the presentation, I have to change my bio because it says LaSalle Park is home to about 1/5 of all trumpeters, and that's not overwintering habitat for about 1/5 of all trumpeters. And that's not true anymore for a couple of reasons. One, as we've had warmer winters, that not as many trumpeters seem to be coming down to LaSalle. And also we just have a bigger population and they're finding other places to go. But still you can usually in most winters see a substantial number of trumpeters at LaSalle Park in Burlington. I always try and recognize Bev and Ray Kingdon when I'm doing these presentations, because Bev and Ray were some of the original volunteers with Harry Lumsden in raising trumpeter swans, and Bev was active in the trumpeter swan restoration group until recent years when her health issues precluded that activity. But they've been strong supporters of the trumpeter swans, and you'll hear some stories. A lot of the stories in the presentation tonight are from Bev. So when they first started releasing the trumpeter swans didn't know where to go. Trumpeter swans were being raised from eggs that came from Alaska, so they had no idea where they should be migrating to. So they were just kind of hanging around wherever they got released, which of course was a big problem because trumpeter swans rely on aquatic vegetation. And when the ponds up north were frozen over, the marshes were frozen over, they couldn't get to food, so they had to be fed over the winter. So they tried all kinds of things to try and establish some kind of migration, and nothing worked. And then something really exciting happened, which is the history of Pigpen. So Bev got a phone call one day from somebody who knew that she was involved with Trumpeter Swans, and she'd been down to LaSalle Park and she thought she'd seen a Trumpeter Swan, which would have been really amazing because no Trumpeter Swan had ever come that far south in Ontario before. This was back in 1993. And so Bev, who not only owned land up north, but she also had a home in Burlington, got really excited to think that a Trumpeter Swan had made it all the way down to Burlington. So she went running down to LaSalle Park and looked for this bird, and she couldn't find it. So she called Marsh and she said, a friend of mine thought she saw a trumpeter and she thought this was the tag number. And they said, oh, we know that bird. Her name is Pigpen. They called her Pigpen because she was a really messy eater. So she was getting corn. It ended up all down the front of her. And so they said, she knows her name. If you go back down to LaSalle and you start calling for her, she'll come to you. So Bev went running back to LaSalle Park and she's running up and down the park, up and down the beach, yelling, Pigpen, Pigpen. Of course, people are looking at her like she's lost her mind. And sure enough, doesn't the bird come right to her? And so that started a long relationship between Bev and Pigpen. Pigpen turned out to be a great mom. Her and her partner were together for about 10 years. And every year she kept coming back to LaSalle Park. And every year she kept bringing more Trumpeter Swans with her. And so that started the first migration of Trumpeter Swans in Ontario in over 100 years. So, you know, LaSalle Park is one of the most important habitats, overwintering habitats for Trumpeter Swans. Usually there's 150 or so Trumpeter Swans at LaSalle. I hear there's about 100 this year. I haven't been down there myself this year, but maybe somebody in the group can confirm there's about 100 there now. They were late coming this year because we had a lot of warmer weather. The best time to see them, if you wanted to go down to LaSalle, is usually between mid-November to the end of February, probably January. The beginning of January is the absolute best time to see the most of them. LaSalle Park is really remarkable in that nature thrives there despite the Hamilton Harbor's industrial heritage, and this picture really tells the story. And the Trumpeter Swans aren't by themselves. They share that habitat with a lot of different kinds of birds. We don't know all the reasons why Trumpeter Swans like LaSalle or why they choose any of the overwintering grounds that they do, but we know that LaSalle has an abundance of aquatic vegetation that's at the right depth because Trumpeter Swans don't dive like ducks do. They just tip their necks. So if the vegetation is too deep for them to reach, they can't feed. LaSalle Park also has some shelter from northerly and easterly winds. It has a beach where the trumpeters can rest and preen. And the beach is also ideal for the Trumpeter Swan Restoration Group. I know there's some members from that group here tonight. And it's a perfect spot for them to tag birds. And so a lot of tagging gets done at LaSalle. And speaking of tagging, here's some of the folks from the restoration group at work. Now in the Western United States, because the birds haven't been worked as closely with as the birds here in Ontario, when they're trying to tag them, I've seen some examples of it where they have to throw nets over the birds and it can be, you know, stressful. But it's really not a very stressful experience because these birds here in Ontario are pretty used to the Trumpeter Swan Restoration Group. And as you can see, all the other birds are milling around and there's Athena going out and grabbing a young swan. They bring it to the beach, tag it quickly. If you have questions about banding and tagging, I'll be happy to answer them. And then a lot of the information about the birds was being sent to the University of Guelph. So more banding and tagging of trumpeters is done at LaSalle, like I said, than any other location. And the group has also helped train some young biologists from the University of Guelph, and that's what you're seeing in this picture. So Trumpeter Swans mate for life. I have to qualify that by saying there's been known to be divorces. There's also been known to be spouse swapping. There's been known to be a few things going on in the trumpeter swan world. Anyone who follows the Facebook page knows that it can be quite a soap opera from time to time. But in general, trumpeter swans mate for life. If one of the pair dies, it's quite common that the other one will find a new mate. Pair bonding usually takes place when the swans are between 3 and 4 years of age, although they may not mate for a couple more years. Trumpeter swans are known to be excellent parents. They've been seen to go after things like mink or snapping turtles if they're after their young. And usually trumpeter swans lay between 4 to 6 eggs, but a record was set in 2011 when this pair successfully raised 10 cygnets. So you wouldn't think that a bird that spends so much time in the water would need to spend a lot of time bathing, but trumpeter swans do, as you can see from these pictures. And that's just because they need to keep their feathers in top condition. So they'll bathe, then they'll get out of the water and they'll start to preen. Trumpeter swans are what we call a Boeing 747 size bird, and they need a lot of space to take off and land. You can see in the top picture how they take off from the water. And then in the bottom picture on the right-hand side, you can see the feet down, arms outstretched. It's, you know, like a plane taxiing into land. So from the end of March until the end of October, trumpeter swans nest in isolated spots in Northern Ontario. Now I say Northern Ontario, but it's not always Northern Ontario. There's trumpeter swans that nest in Toronto. There was even a trumpeter swan that I'll tell you about a little later that nested in Waterdown. So they don't all necessarily go north, but they most times try and find an isolated spot to raise their young. And one of the things that you'll see if you're ever on the Facebook post is that we never make nesting sites public because we want the birds to have their privacy while they're raising their young and not be bothered by a lot of folks. So as fall starts to approach, the parents engage with the young ones in a lot of wing practice, getting them ready for their flight. I think that's a great picture. And then often when it's time to leave to go to the overwintering site, the young from the previous year are usually, well, I wouldn't say usually, but often around where the parents are nesting. So the parents don't let the young stay on the same pond because they want to ensure that there's enough food for the new batch of cygnets that they have. But a lot of times the ones from the year before will follow them up north and they'll be hanging around in the area. And Bev says that it's quite common that as they're ready to leave and go south, the adults will go out and she says, give what she calls a gathering call. And that will bring the ones from the year before together, and then they all fly down south together. So over the winter, the trumpeters congregate in more southern parts of the province in sheltered spots with an abundance of aquatic vegetation that are at shallow enough depths for them to feed. And that's another picture there of LaSalle Park. So over the winter months, that's when all the important social stuff goes on. So that's when the young males are testing each other. That's where pair bonds are formed. And you can see a lot of different behaviors during that time: chasing, feather pulling, victory dances, as you see on the right-hand side, some of the common behaviors that you'd see. And as the season gets closer, so as nesting season gets closer, as January comes to an end and February comes along, you see a lot more action. And that's because the hormones are up. And so there's a lot more testing going on. So trumpeters mostly get along with each other and with the other animals that they share their habitat with, but occasionally things get testy, as you can see in this picture. So we've had now 40 years of efforts to bring back and conserve the trumpeter swans. So why do we still only have about 2,000? There are so many things that can impact them. One of the biggest is lead poisoning. So as trumpeters are pulling up the aquatic vegetation that they feed on, they accidentally pull up lead shot that's down in the marshes. A single pellet, from my understanding, can be enough to kill a trumpeter swan. You can see the picture on the right-hand side, all the shot that trumpeter swan accidentally ingested. Also fishing sinkers, same problem. If a swan has lead poisoning, the behavior, what you see is neurological symptoms. It's kind of like somebody being drunk. They're staggering around. They may be wagging their head from side to side, acting strangely, separating themselves out from others. And sometimes if that behavior is noted and they can be captured in time, they can sometimes be successfully treated. There's also a lot of ingestion of fishing line or entanglement in fishing line that kills trumpeters. Collisions with unmarked power lines. Then of course humans, whether it's hunting, which is illegal but still happens, or harassment, or people letting their dogs go after them. And we have also had deaths caused by watercraft. And then of course there's disease and natural predation. I should acknowledge that the Trumpeter Swan Restoration Group and all the folks who are part of that community are really excellent stewards of the Trumpeter Swans. And a lot of people have eyes on the birds and they note when things are wrong. They call wildlife rescue centers or members of the Trumpeter Swan Restoration Team. And whenever possible, the birds are captured and taken to be rehabilitated. Another problem we have, of course, with trumpeter swans and a lot of wildlife is inappropriate feeding. So more municipalities are enacting bylaws that ban wildlife feeding to discourage nuisance wildlife, but really it's also for the wildlife's own protection. I think that we need to have better signage in places where there's wildlife. I don't think we should just tell people not to do it and that there's fines. I think we should tell them why they shouldn't do it. And the important reason, of course, is because bread and cheese and who knows what else people are feeding creatures. It's not their normal food and it doesn't provide normal nutrition. So when I'm doing these presentations for school kids, it's like us, if we're feeding bread to ducks and trumpeter swans and that kind of thing, it's like us eating nothing but potato chips. It fills our bellies, but it doesn't give us any nutrition. And then in some places, we've also had issues with competing uses. So in some cases, there are ceremonies where wrapped food, wrapped in plastic and plastic flowers and that kind of thing are put into waters where trumpeter swans and other wildlife are, and that can also cause problems. And so that's also just a matter of educating people. So the main thing, if we want to keep trumpeter swans with us, is to protect their habitat, and winter habitat is especially critical. One of the big issues about winter habitat is we've just lost so much of it. So much of our marshlands in southern Ontario are gone. And so places where trumpeter swans would have overwintered are just not there anymore. So protecting winter habitat is really, really crucial. And that's why LaSalle Park, it was so important to us to try and protect that habitat. What happened at LaSalle Park was, I don't know how many years ago now, maybe about 8 or 9 years ago. And this is how I got involved in the whole thing. There was a plan to build a giant rock break wall that would have been 400 meters across. It would have gone almost across the entire harbor, and to add another 120 slips to the small marina that's there and to make the slips permanent. And so when Bev heard about that, she was very concerned and she didn't know what to do about it. And someone suggested she talk to me because I've been involved in a lot of different kinds of environmental advocacy. And told me about it. I told her I would help. So that's how I got involved with trumpeter swans. So we were concerned about this plan. And so we did a whole bunch of things. We applied to the Ministry of the Environment for a Part 2 order, which is basically just a way to request a more stringent environmental assessment of the project. The ministry didn't grant it, but they did take 2 years to think about it. And then when they came back with 3 conditions that had 10 different parts to it. And so it both delayed the project, which gave us more time to lobby, but also in these conditions that they put on the project, one of the things they said is that the Trumpeter Swan Coalition had to be consulted as part of this project. We held out public events. We held a family day event that we've held every year until COVID, every family day in February. We had a website, we put out brochures, we did a door-to-door campaign, we did all kinds of things to educate people about Trumpeter Swans and get them to talk to their council. And I don't even want to think about how many times I made delegations to the council on behalf of protecting this site. So in the end, the marina is not being expanded. They've put in a small floating break wall instead of this massive rock break wall that they wanted to put in. They've said that the slips were going to be permanent, but the last time I was at LaSalle Park in the winter, the slips were up on the dock as they normally have been. So they weren't in the water over the winter. So I'm not sure what happened with that. But in the end, the bottom line is that habitat has been preserved and protected. So now I want to just tell you a couple stories about a few individual swans. These are all stories from Bev. The first one is about a swan named Athena. So Athena created a nest in a marsh, and during a storm, the nest became unmoored and it floated over to where there were railway tracks. And Athena was very concerned about the nest being there, and a train was coming, and she got up on the railway tracks and she spread her wings and she started honking at the train. And the engineer saw her and he did try and stop, but he wasn't able to stop the train in time. And so I think it's a story that just tells you, how strongly these birds will try and defend their young. Were a special pair of swans to Bev. She had known them for a long time. She kept track of them. They were swans that always came down to LaSalle Park, and every year she looked for them. And this one year she went down to LaSalle Park and she was waiting for them to come in. She knew that they'd had 3 cygnets that year. So as she was scanning the skies for them, she indeed saw them coming in, but it was just Mr. Magic and Mrs. Magic and 2 cygnets. And as Mr. Magic got closer, she realized he was covered in some kind of black, oily kind of substance. And so then she got really worried about what happened to the other cygnet and also, what he was covered in. And so she tried to catch him, but she couldn't catch him. And finally it got dark and she just couldn't try anymore. So she went home and she was really worried about him. And she went back first thing the next morning to try and catch him again. And he wasn't there. And of course, she thought the worst had happened. She thought that he'd ingested some of whatever that was and that it got to him. And so she was really fretting about it. And just as she was, ready to burst into tears, Mrs. Magic starts honking and flapping her wings and going crazy. And she looks up and there's Mr. Magic coming in and he's got the other cygnet in tow. And so she figured that whatever trouble they got into along the way, Mr. Magic managed to get his family safely to LaSalle. And then he went back, found the other cygnet and brought him safely in too. And they both turned out to be fine. Whatever it was that was on them didn't appear to cause them any harm. Pigpen, the swan that we talked about that started the migration of trumpeter swans in Ontario, unfortunately came to a sad end. She was deliberately run over by a speedboat. People witnessed the accident. Unfortunately, the folks were never caught. She was taken for rehab for 6 months. They tried to fix her wing, but it didn't heal properly. And she was older by that time and just couldn't recover from the experience. And so she ended up getting pneumonia and dying. But as you saw, Pigpen is memorialized at Marsh. And many trumpeter swans alive today are directly descended from Pigpen. This swan was a swan that Bev named Cinder. You can see this devastating neck injury. When Bev saw it, she couldn't even believe it. She had no idea what had caused it. She didn't think the swan would recover from it, but they managed to catch her. They managed to get her to rehab. They gave her antibiotics and fluids, and they put honey on her neck and then wrapped her neck up. And as you can see in the bottom picture, she healed up just fine. The neck looks a little narrower, but she fully recovered from whatever caused that terrible injury. Rusty was a swan who had a mate, and unfortunately her mate died. And instead of going up north like she usually did when it was time to nest, she ended up creating a nest in a window well in Waterdown, Ontario. So that was kind of an unusual place. And Bev felt that the reason that she put her nest there was because she could see herself in the window and she didn't feel so alone. She managed to raise her cygnets by herself very successfully that year. And then during the winter, during the congregating time, she found herself another mate. Midland-Penetanguishene Ben was a swan that was causing all kinds of trouble on the Midland-Penetanguishene River. He took to chasing boats and to chasing after people on the water, and he was actually causing some injuries to people as he sort of attacked the boats. And so they called up the Trumpeter Swan Restoration Group and they said, you know, we've got to do something about this swan. And Julie didn't know what to do about the swan, but she called Harry, and Harry said, well, I think that swan needs a timeout. So Julie thought, okay, how am I going to get this swan to Y Marsh? So she figured, well, if he was attacking boats and sea-doos, then maybe she should get in a boat or on a sea-doo. And when he attacked her, then she could try and grab him. Now that doesn't sound like much of a plan to me, but that's what Julie did, and it worked. And so she managed to grab him. They took him to Y Marsh and they put him in a pen for the rest of the summer. And then in the winter, they let him out. Well, during the winter, he found a nice young female. They got together, and that was the end of his misbehavior on the Midland-Penetanguishene River. And I say this is an old story about a bad boy meets a nice girl and settles down. So we have people all over the place who really follow these trumpeter swans, and they're out there photographing them and sending messages to the Facebook page about them. And so they really know them well. So this was a soap opera that was literally captured in pictures by people who pay attention to these swans. So this is a story about two swans called John and Grace. They were a happy couple. They had 3 cygnets in the spring of 2017 at Little Britain. The trouble started in December. So the trouble started in December when John got lead poisoning and he had to be taken off to rehab. And while he was gone, another male swan came along and romanced Grace. In the meantime, John gets better and they release him back to the pond. He gets back to the pond and he finds Grace with this swan that has been named Lancelot. And at first he didn't know what to do. He was just kind of looking mournful, wandering around on the beach, looking at the two of them. But then finally he decided he was going to take this guy on. And so they had a whole fight, which John won. So there's John and Grace talking it out. And there's the happy couple together again. And there's John looking triumphant, master again of his pond. So I've really enjoyed my time with these trumpeters, despite all the presentations I had to make at the Burlington Council. The people that you meet when you're working with animals, as I'm sure are the best people. And so trumpeter swans, I think, really bring people together, and you meet great people working with them. And remember that picture I showed you of somebody from the Trumpeter Swan Restoration Group who had grabbed one of the cygnets and they were getting ready to band them? Well, that's Keena. And she met her husband through the Trumpeter Swan work that she did. And when they got married, that was their wedding cake. So trumpeter swans are an amazing and rare story of conservation success, and I think they deserve our continued protection. And the habitat as well deserves our protection, not just for trumpeter swans, but for us too. We need these places and we need this kind of contact with nature. I want to thank Harry Lumsden for his vision in restoring trumpeter swans to Ontario. And I also want to thank all the volunteers who work with the Trumpeter Swan restoration team for continuing to monitor them, band them, and do all the wonderful work that they do. And finally, I want to thank you for your interest in these beautiful birds. And here's a bunch of contacts. There's an email where you can reach me at the Trumpeter Swan Coalition. There's a great Facebook group that's run by the restoration team, which you can find at Ontario Trumpeter Swans. And if you have sightings to report, you can report them at trumpeterswan@live.com. And I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has questions.
Thanks very much, Liz. And I think probably best now if you stop sharing your screen. I don't know if I can do that for you or not. Let me see.
No, I can do it. There we go.
Yep, and you're pinned. Let's see if I can pin myself here. Yep, there we go. That was great. Lots of good stories about trumpeter swans. I'm sure some of the people on the call maybe have some other stories to add, and if you have a good story about trumpeter swans, you can either put it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and get on the call that way. But we have just one question in the chat here. Which professor department uses the trumpeter swan data? I guess the question is, do they use DNA analysis to study the genealogy of the swans to see who's parenting who?
Currently, there's Rod Brook, who's with the MNR in Peterborough, is analyzing the data. He's been working on it for a few months.
So is this Gary talking?
Yeah, and we had a young student at Ryerson use the data earlier this year and wrote his thesis on that. There is no professor per se who heads the program. It's just us volunteers who do it. With regards to DNA, at this time, there has been no DNA taken. We do take blood from birds, but that's specifically for another research project, which is measuring lead levels over long periods of time. That's going to be several years in the doing. Any genealogy is done through the tag and banding, and wherever young cygnets are tagged, every effort is made to identify the parents, and the data is logged in our database.
This is just to introduce Gary to the group here. This is Gary Lane, who is a wealth of knowledge on trumpeter swans. He kind of keeps all the spreadsheets. He knows where all the swans are in Ontario, right, Gary?
Yes.
Okay.
I have a little story. A couple years ago, up in Lock 45 and up in Port Severn, my tutor, as in Laurel Ironside, decided to go away again to Mexico. So I was with her for about 3 years. I was her wingman, and I got to watch her and spend a lot of time with the swans while I was feeding them. And suddenly, this winter, she's gone. I got a phone call, and there's apparently a swan trapped where they were doing all the work at Lock 45. And I says, okay. And I got a call, and I nobody else around to do it. And never ever actually had to rescue or capture a swan in any way, but I watched her do, Laurel do a lot of them. So anyway, I headed up to Port Severn, and I was directed, and the maintenance people who were doing all the work actually left the gate open for me. So I was able to go in a snowstorm, and I managed to see the swan, and the swan had a number on it. So we knew it had been captured previously, and was trapped in an area where I couldn't get out of. So I kept getting closer, and I got down, I kept getting closer and closer. Finally, I within about 5 feet to decide he was going to leave, but there was nowhere to go. So I says, well, it's just me and you. So I managed to get the swan, and I had it all, all hugged into myself. And I guess people from across the way in the grill were watching. And it was just a matter of now looking at it, looked okay. And just kind of reached over a rail. It was about 7 feet to the water. And I says, well, this is just, spread your wings and away you go. Well, it just slided down onto the water, and then it drank and drank and drank, because it was there for 2 days. So it had no like it eat snow and stuff like that, but it managed to do okay. And after that, it was fine. So there was another story not too long after that. I get another phone call, and there is another bird trapped in I call the doldrums of where they were doing all the work. And this is where the bottom, you see where all the water comes out. Well, I was down at the bottom. This is where this bird was, underneath a bunch of rebar. So now a K82, which is one of our swans, is now nicknamed Rebar. And so I had to rescue that one. And it was me and the maintenance people, the way we go. And I had a carrier. So we get down to the bottom and try to chase him around. He's underneath the rebar. And so the guy says, what do you do? I says, well, hey, we got to get him out of there. And I knew the swan. And it was also one of his young ones that I named. We caught it as a young one, and actually named it after my mother, who had passed away that year. So I said, we got to get you out of here. So he started walking on the rebar, and I said, you scare it towards me and I'll try to catch it as it go along the rock wall. Well, all of a sudden it stops. It starts eating, and I says, they had put some bread out, try to attract it. And I said, this is not time for you to eat. We need you to get out of here. So we managed to get it close to me. I got it, put it in a sling, up we go, and we release it. So I figured, okay, this is a good winner. A week later, I got a phone call from one of the maintenance guys. He says, you were here a week ago. I goes, yeah. He says, we got one in the same place. And I says, you got to be kidding me. I go up there again. This one was on tag. It was an adult, and we chased that one around a few times. But from the first time, I had my little carrier, but we had ripped the zipper a little bit, so the carrier wasn't working quite right. So we get up there. We managed to chase it around. It gets up on this rock wall, and there's snow and everything else. And we caught it. Gets it in the zipper. He starts to get out. All I hear is zip. Out goes the bird. So we chased it. Finally managed to get it again, and we got it out of there. So that was my experience of my first 3 captures, and it was quite the thing. So now I'm actually not banning and tagging because I'm not trained, but I actually now Laurel lets me catch some of the swans that she's not able to catch because they know her really well and they kind of stay away from her a little bit. But I got to be really friendly with them, and I've captured a few of them, and we get tags on. So it's been 6 years of just so much fun and everything else. And I never, just every day now, it's just been, a blessing, and the nice people I meet. And Gary's over there, and some information from him, and I do. A lot of people are always asking me questions, and I'm so glad to be able to tell them and do what I can. So anyway,
Jim, hold up your hands so we can see if you got all 10 fingers still. But no, the other one too. Yeah, okay, all 10.
Yeah,
there we go.
Somebody asked me, one of my friends asked me the other day, and I'm feeding with the hand, because I never get pictures of them because I'm always behind the camera, and I'm feeding them, and somebody says, well, you still got your 10 fingers? I goes, oh yeah. Sometimes they're trying to eat your fingers, but they're okay. So
Okay. Thanks a lot, Jim. Now, there's another question here from maybe Liz or Gary. If occasionally feeding them. Now, maybe you can tell us about what you think about feeding swans. I've seen some that only let the volunteers who know what they're doing do the feeding. But if occasionally feeding them, which is not recommended, what is acceptable grain, or what could you feed them?
Untreated corn. So
And
untreated.
where do you
untreated,
where do you get that?
You can get it from bird feeding stores, but you have to make sure that it's untreated, so no pesticides or chemicals or anything on it. We don't recommend feeding wild animals. The Trumpeter Swan Restoration Group does use corn to lure the swans. So they're allowed to do that at LaSalle, even at, that was one of the things that we got when we made the deal with the town, was that the Trumpeter Swan Restoration Team would be allowed to continue to use corn to lure the swans. And also we got them to agree that should the harbor freeze over for an extended period of time, the Trumpeter Swan restoration team would be allowed to feed the Trumpeter Swans corn. So corn is not going to hurt them. We don't encourage feeding, but we know people do. And so if you're going to feed, corn is okay. Trumpeter swans, especially in the winter, if it's a hard winter and they can't get to the aquatic vegetation they normally feed on, they like the carbs from the corn. And in the wild, especially in the West, where there's fields of grain and harvested corn, you'll find trumpeter swans in those fields over the winter, feeding up on the carbs. So I don't know if Gary wants to add anything to that, but that's my take on it.
Yeah, Liz, that's what we say. There's been a number of posts on the Facebook page about feeding, and the position that we adopt is that it is preferred to leave them find food naturally. They need to find natural food because it has all of the minerals and the vitamins and everything that it needs. And as opposed to corn, which is a limited in its ability to sustain them over a long period of time. Also, too, it's preferred to not habituate swans to people as a source of food, because there are any number of instances today where people know that you can go out and you basically call them in and they come right to you. And if it happens to be complete novices to seeing a swan, they get a little bit disconcerted when these large birds come right to them, and they're not. It's not a good thing to have happen. So the preference is, wherever possible, let them forage for their food naturally, and they will. If one area becomes grazed to the point where they can't feed it, they'll find another place. They will go looking for food and they will find it. But as Liz says, untreated whole corn is preferred, and please don't throw it on the ground, because what happens is it doesn't all get eaten. And in bad cases up in Washego, where corn was being left on the snow and the ice, myriad of waterfowl would come in and defecate on the beach. And the next thing is the corn's getting moldy and they're getting disease and sickness from the food being left on the shore. So up there, they have a bucket that's hung from a post. It's just high, it's high enough. The swans can reach it, but the ducks can't.
What about in the water, Gary? Because I noticed at Washego, people were throwing corn in the water.
That's preferred, because it doesn't. If you're going to do that, we prefer that it is put on into the water. That's rather than on the ground.
Dave Hawk is here, and Dave said he had some stories he wanted to share.
Liz, I really appreciate your tip of the hat to Pigpen. I've got a couple prequel stories to Pigpen. By happenstance, I was working with the minister.
Sorry, Dave, just because maybe everybody here knows Dave, right? But there might be a couple people that don't. But Dave started his career at the Y Marsh, so he was probably there when the whole thing got going. But now he's a nature writer, and he's done a lot of conservation work. He's working with Kate Harries down in Tiny Marsh right now. Take it away, Dave.
Okay, thanks, Ken. Anyhow, so I was working, the marsh manager for Y Marsh and Tiny Marsh was Andy Fletcher. Andy was also very much part of the reintroduction of the giant Canada goose to Ontario, and Y and Tiny were sites. So Andy and Harry Lumsden got together and they agreed that Y Marsh would be a great place to bring these trumpeter swans in. So the M&R is very much involved. We made agreements with Bob Whittam and others at Y Marsh, which was federal property. And there was some funding that was required to get these two adult swans, the original pair, to Y Marsh to see if they would breed, to see if we get the program going. And so there's some money involved, some funding had to go down, paperwork had to be done. And these two swans showed up were delivered at Y Marsh. And about 2 months after that, I was at the office with Andy. He's opening the mail and he lets out this big whoop and starts laughing like crazy. And I said, "What's up?" "Well, if you work for the government, anytime you buy something, it gets inventoried. And to track the inventory, you get a little white sticker to put on your file cabinet or computer or typewriter. So someone at Queen's Park had sent us 2 stickers to be applied to Swan Trumpeter male and Swan Trumpeter female." So last I saw, these 2 registration stickers were still on the bulletin board at Tiny Marsh. So we got quite a kick out of that. Somebody felt that these swans were now government property and had to be duly inventoried and tracked with these stickers. The other quick thing on that is I really want to give a shout out to the 2 handlers at Y Marsh. Don Foxall and Mary Cameron were working at Y Marsh, basically on maintenance at the time. And they were assigned to look after these first pair of birds that showed up. And they basically adopted them as their kids. And so Don and Mary, they literally camped out at night to make sure there's no disturbance to these swans. They did nest, they did have, they laid eggs. It was super exciting. And Mary would spend her nights there patrolling around the nest site, make sure the raccoons didn't jump the fence and come in and take the eggs or the cygnets. So for several years, Don Foxall and Mary Cameron, they looked after these very original swans that showed up at Y Marsh. And I was always amazed at their dedication to make sure these swans were safe and looked after. They, like I say, they treated them like their own kids. And from that first pair of swans, we got one of their offspring, which was Pigpen. And it was Mary Cameron who named that swan because she loves the Charlie Brown Peanuts cartoon strip, in which that messy little kid, Pigpen, is featured in that. So that's where the name came from. She thought it applied to this particular swan. As Liz mentioned, it was a very messy bird. It's just always covered in mud and slop. So anyhow, a couple little things just by happenstance. I happen to be connected with the original rival of these swans. And it's just amazing now to go up to Washego for my world and see 80, 90 swans up there, knowing that most of them did indeed come from that first pair at Y Marsh. Anyhow, I just thought I'd share that and give Liz a little prequel.
Dave, didn't Pigpen have to be treated for lead shot as well at one point? Or was that another swan?
I don't know. I
remember,
right, but I
can remember at Y Marsh when they first sort of discovered that it was lead shot that was causing someone. I thought Pigpen had to be rescued from it, but I could be wrong about that. And they eventually got Bob Whittam got lead shot banned at the marsh.
Yeah, I think you might be right, Ken, because that board is there, the one that they're replacing, the sign about Pigpen. Mm-hmm. And I believe there is something about lead shot as well as her being shot? No, she was hit by a boat. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think they were able to get her recovered from the lead shot, but
yeah, she went through a lot of stuff before she succumbed. I was just going to mention, or actually ask Liz a question as well, but I worked for a year at the Y Marsh back in 2006, and I shared an office with Julie Key, and I think, Liz, you mentioned Julie.
Yes.
And I just wondered if she's still involved with the program.
She is.
Oh, okay. Can you please say hi to her for me?
I will.
Susan says hi. We shared an office. It was an interesting year for sure, and a lot of it was watching Julie with the swans and just tagging them and everything else. And it was fascinating. Lots of fun. So glad to know the program carries on.
I have a couple of questions about banding, if I can.
Sure.
I understand from Jim that they're not doing any banding this year, I guess, again, because of COVID. Am I right about that, Jim?
No.
Nope. They
No,
are
they are.
banding.
We are banding. we're just waiting for the permit to come through. The banding permit has to be renewed annually. And it's like January 1st through December 31st. And I guess it's government and it's COVID, and it does, as of yesterday morning, it had not come through for this year.
Okay. The other question I have, you're running out of the current letter number sequence. What are you going to move to after you've got Z100?
We have two more sets. I think it's two more sets. I think it's a U and I forget the other letter, a pre-printed ready to go. And then it's a question of what are we going to do after that? But that's, we're permitted to tag and band 120 birds a year. Last year we did 108, I think. So you can figure we've got about 3 years supply. So we've already used 0 to, or we've already used 100 to 999. So what are we going to do going forward? I don't know at this point. I don't think any.
Okay, well, you keep me in suspense. While I'm here, I want to thank Liz for her presentation. I got to say, some of the stories were quite touching. I got a little misty a couple of times there. It's really nice to hear those personal stories. So thanks, Liz.
You're welcome.
Now, swans are people too, right? But a question here. This is from Jeannie Woolnough. I live on Lake St. John, just outside of Washego. Should I be recording tags and then counting signets associated with tag parents? Now, yes. Maybe Gary and Liz, you can, and also you might want to, you get a lot of questions. Well, where did this swan come from? And of course, all that information can be got on the Facebook Trumpeter Swan Facebook. But tell us all about that, Gary or Liz.
So for information on the swans, if you have a tag number, if you go to the Facebook page and you put the tag number, there's a little search thing on the Facebook page. Anytime that swan was mentioned, it will come up. So you can often learn a lot about a trumpeter swan just by putting the tag number in the search bar on the Facebook page. And Gary, if you want to answer the rest of it.
And if anybody has any questions about a particular bird, like what can you tell me, we'll do our best to answer it for you. In answer to the question about reporting, my answer to anybody is we'll take every report you can do. If you want to report every day, 365 days a year of trumpeter swans that are in your pond, we want that. So any and all swans, whether or not they're with cygnets, if there are cygnets, we track as closely as possible the life cycle of the family from the moment that they lay the eggs, if we can, without disturbing the birds, see how many eggs there are, how many hatch, and as time progresses over the next 6 to 8 months, how does the family survive? They may start off with six cygnets, and then they'll lose one, and then they'll lose another. And it gets to this time of the year when the families begin to start breaking up, where the cygnets in the transit coming, their parents are leading them to come down to the southern parts of the province. The cygnets will get lost on the way and they wind up going over to Frenchman's Bay, and then they'll hang around with other families over there. So the key thing for us is to understand the losses of the cygnets through the first 6 or 8 months of their life. So every report is important and it all gets logged.
So you can report trumpeter swan sightings and tag numbers at Trumpeter Swan at live.com.
Yeah.
Trumpeter Swan at live.com.
Yeah, and I think, Liz, just on that, because we're going to send a recording of this out to everybody, and I think your final screen maybe had a typo on that. There was an R missing or something, but it's basically Trumpeter Swan. If you give it again, where to report, maybe. And
the question about reporting these, I always record all the tag numbers I see and I report them on eBird. You guys Pick up the data from eBird. I thought so. Okay.
Yeah, we get from eBird, iNaturalist, the Facebook page, Instagram, the various groups who have Facebook pages themselves, naturalist groups in other cities and towns. We also have the Facebook page is set up a reporting system on, you can link to it and you can fill out the information there. People also, the Y-Marsh has a reporting system. They send all those reports to us. The Trumpeter Swan Society in the US also has a reporting system, and they send their information to us as well.
I think the answer to Jeannie was, yeah, you can talk to Gary every day if you want. He wants to know what's going on with your swans. And there's many ways to reach him. Another question here coming from Mandy Hay. Can anyone speak to the introduction of the swans to the Sudbury area? It says there was a microlight project in 1996. I'm not sure what that means, but
there, I know a little bit about it, that there was a project where they were trying to use the microlights to train the swans to follow the microlights.
You're talking about the aircraft or the
to train them, to teach them to migrate. And that was, I believe, was several years' efforts, and it was not successful and discontinued.
Okay.
I have a question or a comment. Liz, I can understand what you're saying about signage being needed. I have family in Hamilton, and so whenever I go down, I always go to LaSalle Park. And one time, a couple of years ago, I saw a family, and they allowed their toddler to feed the swans out of its hand, birdseed out of its hand. I was quite upset, thinking, like, if anything happened, if that swan attacked the child, it would be the swan that would be in trouble. But what's your comment on that?
Yes, so these are big birds, and while they are not known to be an aggressive animal, and they are habituated to humans in some cases, quite unfortunately, they have to be treated with respect. So I would never put a small child in front of a trumpeter swan. And I think people should keep a respectful distance from wildlife. So even though I've been involved with the trumpeter swans for a long time, and even though I've been down on the beach while they're doing the banding and tagging, I don't feed the swans. And I try and keep a respectful distance from them, several feet away from them. So I encourage that. I have some good posters that I can share about not feeding trumpeter swans. It's something I encourage people to post and share, because we have to teach more people about what the issues are. One of the other big issues is not everybody is nice. You habituate wildlife to people, they're going to run into people who aren't going to be nice. And you know, we've had trumpeter swans killed by any number of bad situations. One of the recent things that happened in Bluffers Park in Toronto is people come in their cars, sit in the parking lot, throw food out of their cars, encouraging the trumpeter swans to come into the parking lot. We've had 2 trumpeter swans run over at Bluffers Park in the parking lot. So, you know, we need to have good signage, not just don't do it, but why not to do it. And we need to have a lot more education in the public.
What was that story? I think, was it last year or 2 years ago, a trumpeter swan abduction down at LaSalle?
Yes, a woman did grab a trumpeter swan and try and put it in the backseat of her car. And she was seen doing that, and police were called. I think she had some issues. The trumpeter swan wasn't hurt in the incident. She didn't drive away with it. So it was handled.
Okay. Well, I think that, anybody else got any other questions or additions? Jim?
Yeah, I had one little thing. A couple of years ago, I had mentioned earlier about in Port Severn, we actually caught a swan, and it was a female, so we named it after my mother, Clara. So for a year and a half, we seen her, we knew where we were. Then a little about a year after that, I asked Gary if he had any reports of her. just to see if she's still been around or whatever. And he got back to me, and apparently my mom was living in West Virginia. He was reported on 3 different occasions down there around a golf course, and a couple other just off of trying to remember something Sylvania there. Anyway, but anyway, Gary found out he gets reports from down there, but mom was living the life of Riley and warm weather. So I haven't heard any more of her, but anyway, let's see what happens.
One of the really nice things about this Trumpeter Swan restoration program is not only have we brought them back to Ontario, but now they're starting to literally spread their wings and turn up in all kinds of odd places. So hopefully, despite the loss of habitat, we'll be able to see Trumpeter Swans reestablishing routes down through the eastern seaboard of the United States, out into the eastern parts of Canada. It's really exciting to see how far we've come, despite all the obstacles, how far we've come with this program. So I think it really is a wonderful story of conservation success.
Well, thanks for telling us all about it, Liz. And I have something else to share before we close the meeting. But you can see this is our club logo behind me, and you can see how close to our hearts Trumpeter Swans are. We adopted that logo just a couple of years ago. It was designed for us by Claire Holden, and we love, all of our members love seeing the Trumpeter Swans up here, but we don't mind sharing them with Burlington and Hamilton. Thank you very much for protecting their habitat down there. And with that, thank you again. But usually at our monthly meetings, we have what we call sightings, and all the members can speak up and tell us what they've seen. That's a little difficult to do on Zoom. If somebody really wants to tell us something they've seen, you go ahead. But we have several club photographers in the group, and they always send me photos, and I'm going to try to share my screen right now and share some of the photos that have been sent to me. Let's see if that works. Can everybody see that?
White-fronted.
Let's see, I have to, let me just set a few things up here. How's that look? Anyways, this was all these photos were taken in January of this year, and some of them are by me, some by Bob Codd. We have some photos here from Mary Rajapaksi, and some from Garrett Van Gelderen, some from Peter Hoff. And I may not be able to tell you who took them all as we float by, but this was a great bird that showed up in Penetang on January 1st, a greater white-fronted goose. Now, we often see these birds down at the big pond down by Tiny Marsh, but usually we have to look at so far away from them, and they're really hard to pick out when they're in with like 500 Canada geese. So it's nice to have this one very close in Rotary Park in Penetanguishene. And you'll get more of these birds out west than you do in Ontario. But this was a great one to start the year off with. And in North America, the greater white-fronted goose is also called by the hunters called a speckle belly. And in this photo, you can see why it gets that name. It's speckled on the belly. There's the greater white-fronted goose again, showing it with the Canada goose. And of course, we love taking Trumpeter Swans. Bob took this one on the Wye River. Another one flying over Rotary Park in Penetanguishene. This is a beautiful shot of Trumpeter Swans at Port Severn. And if you want to see a whole bunch of Trumpeter Swans, go up to Washega or Port Severn. Bill tells me there's about 100 around the Narrows and Orillia. And I was down to Wye Marsh, and while the weather was warm, there's been quite a few out right out in the middle of the marsh where they're hard to see, but now they're all gathering at the usual swan pond. There was about at least a couple dozen of them there just a couple of days ago. Here they are in Port Severn. These are Jim Charlebois' photos. There's Jim getting up close and personal with V15. More Jim shots from Port Severn. And I often go over to Collingwood where there's a little pond by the waste treatment center there where you can get some unusual ducks. Here you've got a pair of northern pintails. There's the male, there's the female, and there's an American coot hiding in there too. Common golden eyes in Collingwood. Bob took a trip up to Algonquin Park last weekend and he got 3 lifers. He got his first spruce grouse. Beautiful photo of the spruce grouse.
In a spruce.
Yeah, was it in a spruce? Yep.
Yeah, it was. And it was eating spruce needles.
Yeah. And there's been quite a gaggle of wild turkeys gathering along Balm Beach Road, right near the old McLean Hunter TV studio there. There's probably more wild turkeys in this flock than we got in our Christmas bird count. But red-tailed hawk in Midland, another red-tailed hawk. It gets a little harder to see birds in January, but we managed to find a few. This is a rough-legged hawk, and rough-legged hawks, when they hunt, they'll often hover just like a kestrel, and this is what this hawk is doing, beating its wings, staying in one spot. Northern harriers, I think, do that too, but when you see a hawk, you know it's not a red tail when you see it doing this hovering motion. There's the rough-legged hawk again. They also have those black patches at the wrist. This is a Cooper's hawk in Midland. That's Bob's photo of the same hawk, Cooper's hawk. This is over in Collingwood again, a couple of female bufflehead with the American coot that hangs out there. And now I think we've really hit our bag limit for snowy owls, but I'm going to show you a bunch. Some of these are my photos, some Bob Codd's photos, and a lot of them are Mary's. Mary likes to go down and see as many snowy owls as she can. Lots of snowies. Beautiful bird.
Where were they?
Well, they were all over the place.
Photos of were around Tiny Marsh area.
Some in Minising. The one I had on the picnic bench was over in Collingwood Harbor. Snowy, snowy, snowies. But this is not a snowy. This is a barred owl. They should be around too. Woodpeckers, pileated woodpecker. This was a nice photo I got. Managed to get the male red-bellied and the female red-bellied on the same perch. This was at Garrett Van Gelderen's feeders. He gets a lot of nice birds there, and he's the one that got us a yellow-bellied sapsucker and a northern flicker on the Christmas bird count. There's the yellow-bellied sapsucker, and this is Gary's photo of the same bird, and that's the flicker that's been hanging around his feeders. And Gary also sent he gets hairy woodpeckers there. Not too many kestrels that hang around our area in the winter, but there was one down by Tiny Marsh. And winter's the time to see northern shrikes in our area. Nice photo from Bob Codd here. There's my photo of another one. Blue jay up in Algonquin Park. And one of Bob's other lifers was Canada jays.
Yeah.
They're declining in Algonquin Park, but it's still a good place to go and see them. Had to throw a chickadee in there. Gary sent us this red-breasted nuthatch at his feeders. Nice photo of a brown creeper, and you can see it manages to find a few bugs even in the winter. One of the prettiest birds that we have. Don't you agree, the starling? Very pretty.
Really, it is.
Yeah. We had a kind of early in January, there was kind of a flush of cedar waxwings that came through the area, feeding on some of those berries on the trees. I was quite pleased to get this photo, Lapland longspurs. I really couldn't identify them as such till I got my photo home because they were way out in the field. So I was quite pleased that I actually got a photo where they can be identified as Lapland longspurs. They are mixed in with a field of foreign larks. And a big flock of snow buntings down by Tiny Marsh. This photo probably only shows less than a quarter of the flock. There they are up in the air. I think I counted about 400 in the flock. Every once in a while you get a red wing blackbird that hangs around somebody's feeders. This was down by Minising. And Peter Huff, he's been having a great catbird hanging around his feeder all winter. But last year was a bumper year for these birds, the evening grosbeaks. Not as many around this year, but Peter did have him visit his feeder one day this month. One of Bob's other lifers at Algonquin Park, the pine grosbeak.
Oh,
Not a lifer.
not a lifer.
Wasn't a lifer? Oh, no, yeah, you're sorry. You have them in your backyard, don't you?
Yeah.
So what your 3 lifers were spruce grouse? Oh yeah, we're coming to the third one. Spruce grouse, gray jay, Canada jay. We'll come to the third one. Little house finch on the Wye River, male house finch. Here's his other lifer at Algonquin Park, the white-winged crossbill. This is the female, or possibly an immature male. Males would have more of a red tinge. Pine siskins up at Algonquin. And, you know, when you see all the tracks in the snow when you go out, you think there must be a lot of mammals and animals out there, but you just don't see them. But every once in a while, there's somebody like this otter will cooperate and you get to see a mammal for a change. And people sent me a bunch of photos. When they weren't seeing birds, they were seeing a lot of interesting ice formations, which make for nice photos. These are some of Bob's photos. Pancake ice in Port Severn.
Wow.
And Mary gets to watch the ice move in Sawlog Bay where she lives.
Awesome.
That's Mary's favorite rock out in the bay, getting covered with ice. Now it's really covered. Mary calls herself a rock hugger. Some people are tree huggers. She calls herself a rock hugger. There's the icebreaker coming into break up ice in Midland Harbor. And I think that's about it. Let me unshare my screen if I can figure out how to do that.
Beautiful pictures.
How do I get my buttons back here? Let's see. There we go. Okay, so that's about it. Thanks everybody for coming. Susan, you want to say goodbye to everybody?
Maybe she's already left.
Maybe she has, yeah.
Sorry,
I think
indisposed for a moment there. Yes, thank you everybody for joining us, and we'll see you next month.
Yeah, I don't have a speaker booked for next month yet, but again, we'll be it'll be the third Thursday of the month as usual. I have I'll be able to. I've got a couple of people that are going to reply to me fairly soon that will be able to let you know who it is going to be soon. We do have a speaker booked for March. It'll be David from Algonquin Park talking about herpetology up there. Liz, if you're still on, we had one more question. Or Gary, are there trumpeter recovery programs in the U.S.?
Yes. Yes, there are. Gary might know more about them than I do, but there are some zoos that actually have trumpeter swan breeding programs. And there are reintroduction programs throughout the Midwest and the western part of the country. So, yes.
Well, I understand. I was reading that there is indigenous hunting of the birds out west, but I don't think in general they're hunted, are they?
No.
No.
We do have someone here in Ontario, though, who has tried several times to get trumpeter swans put on the hunting list.
With only 2,000 of them?
Yes, so far without success. So let's hope it stays that way.
Yeah.
Yes.
Jeez.
Okay. I think that just about does it.
Okay, good night, everyone.
I'm going to stop the recording. And if people want to hang around and chat, they're welcome to, but
Thank you. Thank you.
where's my
Good night,
recording?
everybody.
Thanks, Liz.
Night.
Thanks, Ken.
Night. Thank you very much.
Super program. Thank you so much.
Yes, lovely pictures. Thank you.
Night, Mary Ellen. Night, John Boy. Yeah.